Okay, guys, what is up? Welcome to another module. Let's dive right in. So, to recap what we've been doing, we've been looking at how the president has become more powerful, an overall look at policy decisions from presidents and how consequential they were, and these are main decision points to reference later. So for last module, we looked at the abilities of the presidency and that being like different cabinet positions and the almost unilateral ability to set foreign policy after the expansion of powers. So that build-up going on from Monroe to now, and continuing to grow. Then we have the limitations of the presidency today. For limitations to the presidency, we can look at internal and external limitations. So from within our internal limitations, we have institutional, being stuff like Congress, which of course makes laws, and then the Supreme Court, which gives judgments on whether laws are constitutional or not. And the big limiting factor from the Constitution being, of course, think about it for a second, the Bill of Rights. Hopefully you got that. And there's the laws that are already on the books, which is sort of derivative from Congress and Supreme Court, but we'll go over it nonetheless. And then there's informal limitations, and that can be stuff like public opinion, bureaucratic inertia, and interest groups. And then there's also external limitations, which are basically these institutional things like treaties. We don't really think of treaties as a limitation, but it is you agreeing to not do something, which is by definition a limitation. Related to that is international law, which is normally derivative from treaties, but it's almost a thing in its own at the same time. And there's informal, being stuff like global public opinion, integrated global economy, and norms. And you see this less with foreign policy, but there are congressional limitations on the presidency. One of the ones that's very relevant right now, especially if you've been following the news, is the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Another one is two-thirds treaty ratification. So the president can't agree to treaties without two-thirds ratification from Congress. We talked about this earlier, but approval for senior level cabinet positions and the War Powers Resolution, which we'll get to that in a second. So president is in charge of the Department of Justice, like we talked about. And if the Department of Justice doesn't want to do something, Congress can compel it to. So what's happened recently is the Epstein Files Transparency Act, led by these two congressmen, Ro Khanna on the left and Thomas Massie on the right, supported by Marjorie Taylor Greene in the white coat there. But what this means is that even though the president doesn't want to, even though the Department of Justice doesn't want to, Congress still has the authority to compel them to do this, as long as they have the votes, which in this case they did. And as we talked about, there are specific reasons why the president and the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, might not want to do it. That being said, they don't have a choice because of this limitation on the presidency. And if the president, the cabinet, don't do a good enough job, then people can be called to testify as to why they didn't do a good job and stuff like that. So here you have Pam Bondi, Attorney General, and Kash Patel, Director of the FBI, yesterday called before Congress to explain why they didn't do what they said they would or what they were compelled to. Also, the president can't make treaties without two-thirds congressional approval. Probably the most famous example of this is Woodrow Wilson trying to get the United States to join the League of Nations. Not the UN, League of Nations is different. And as we talked about, he wasn't able to get the votes. He had a stroke, so he really wasn't able to be as effective politically as he would probably have wanted to be. And he wrote a lot of the foundational ideas for what the League of Nations would be, but couldn't get the votes, so he wasn't able to join, even though probably having the most impact on its founding more than any individual, leading to this very awkward situation where the sort of idea originators of the League of Nations aren't actually members. We talked about this last module too, but of course Congress will also need to vote and approve on senior level cabinet positions. So on the left you have the photo from Secretary of State Marco Rubio's approval. And normally these are pretty easy to pass through because Republicans are normally in power if a Republican president is elected. And even then, there's sort of a logic of appropriateness or norms where it's as long as they're not too egregious, then the Democrats will sometimes approve of Republicans, so Republicans will return the favor when Democrats are in power, and vice versa. Two exceptions, of course, Matt Gaetz and Neera Tanden, due to their own personal life issues. Neither of them were ever actually put up to a vote, and that's also sort of a logic of appropriateness is if they're pretty sure they're not going to pass, then they don't even put themselves forward to save themselves the embarrassment of failing a vote. So Matt Gaetz, Republican, Neera Tanden, Democrat. Big one is the War Powers Resolution. We've brushed on this before. This was made in response to the Vietnam War, where, of course, no congressional vote. The United States had gotten involved in Vietnam for a very long time. People are drafted, all that. And it balances these two ideas that Congress alone can declare war, but the president is commander in chief, so he can tell the military to do whatever he wants. So this was an effort to sort of square those two ideas. So if the president deploys the military, he has to give within 48 hours, he has to give a report as to the justification and overall why he's sending troops, what they're hoping to accomplish within the timeline. From boots hitting the ground, he has 60 plus 30 days. So 60 days to do the conflict. And to extend that, he needs a declaration of war, pass a resolution for funding, or vote to extend the deadline. So like what we saw with the global war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, there had to be the vote for the authorization of the use of military force, or AUMF, to fight Al-Qaeda, mainly in Afghanistan. And then there was the 2002 vote, which was basically the same thing, but with Iraq. And that's what launched off the much longer than 60 plus 30 days of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, what's this plus 30 I keep talking about? Well, that's 30 days to withdraw. So if the president isn't able to get any three of these things, then he still has 30 days to withdraw forces. Beyond that, we have the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS for short, Supreme Court of the United States, and their limitations on basically everything within government. They're the final say. But that includes the president. Two big examples, one Republican, one Democrat. The Republican one was the USAID freeze we talked about last class. A lot of the money was already earmarked and was so far down in the process that there had to be this big legal battle over it. Eventually, the Supreme Court decided that the money still had to be sent out, and I believe it was. One that the president won, though, was during the Biden administration. There's this debate over, can the Texas National Guard put a razor wire to keep out illegal immigrants? So Biden versus Texas, Supreme Court sided 5-4 with Biden. So Biden barely won. But this was probably the more dramatic of the two because the Texas National Guard was ordered to keep doing what it was doing. And people were really concerned that there'd be a standoff between the Texas National Guard, or Texas's essentially state army, and the federal army. Of course, nothing happened. We haven't devolved into civil war, and the issue's pretty much resolved. But it was very touch and go for a minute. Another limitation is that the president has to follow the laws that are already there before he comes into power. So one example being Augusto Pinochet. He's a dictator from Chile, very, very, very anti-communist. We talked about him before. He would put communists into helicopters, fly them way over the Pacific Ocean, and then push them out of the helicopter, killing them essentially. But brutal military dictator that the U.S. government was supporting. The thing is the U.S. isn't allowed to support people who are committing war crimes. So, while nothing really came of this, it was still technically a limitation on the president that was never really enforced. Now, those are the formal limitations, but we also have the informal limitations. So, one being public opinion. A lot of the time, the president will decide not to do something, not because it's illegal, but because he will feel accountable to the voters and not want to do it. Bush is sort of an exception to the rule, where as his administration went on, his public opinion was basically hitting record lows. And another limitation that is informal is this bureaucratic inertia, or just because the president orders someone to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it, especially if they know the system better than the president does, and it's not really that much on the president's radar. So this is James Jeffrey. He's a diplomat for Syria, and he and some generals were ordered to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria. And what had happened is a lot of troops were withdrawn from Syria, but not all of them. And James Jeffrey would go on to admit under oath that he said he hadn't lied, he had just intentionally obfuscated, or he was basically quibbling about the troop withdrawal. So you can think of it as insubordination or something like that. But if bureaucrats don't want to do something, they can, one, not do it, or two, make the process as time-consuming and painful as possible so that they effectively don't do it. And then there's the case of interest groups, which I don't think anybody likes. A lot of this is pulled from Open Secrets, which is sort of this gold standard for following interest groups and who's paying politicians or who's influencing politicians with money. Now, I remember back in the day there was a comedian, I forgot who, but he had joked about how politicians need to wear their sponsors on their jackets, like how NASCAR drivers will do it, which is obviously not the case. They wear black suits and the like, but it's an idea that Open Secrets kind of took, and so you can look up this website, find out who is funding your congressman, congresswoman, your senators, and stuff like that. It's a very interesting way to lose at least a few hours. It kind of feels like a potato chip. You can't look up just one. For example, have you ever noticed that UT campus is surrounded on three sides by highways, super overdeveloped highways, and then on the fourth side by the river? Well, it's an effect of interest groups on Congress. Before Congressman Burchett, the House of Representatives congressman was Jimmy Duncan Jr. Before him was Jimmy Duncan Sr., who had very big ends with the transportation industry, construction and the like. I don't know about Sr., but I remember Jimmy Duncan Jr. was on the Transportation Committee. So he has all this access to funds, all these interest groups who are going to make money from building highways, and that's why UT campus is so congested right now. because overdevelopment of roads. But I mean, look at the bright side. Some construction company for highways made a lot of money. So that's who it's really about. It's really about how much these lobbyists can make. That's the important thing. I'm being sarcastic, by the way. So I looked up the current president and the most recent president, and you can get an idea of what industries are funding. Um, and so you notice it's about the same. Single issue is a bit bigger with Trump. That being said, it's a very, very interesting way to look up and see, oh, this is where a lot of policy comes from informally. And of course, if you're paying attention to the last election cycle, you saw that there's the big swing from Silicon Valley, especially going from hard left to hard right. I think everyone kind of knew that was in rhetoric only. Silicon Valley's only real loyalty is to their shareholders. But all these different CEOs, especially within the tech industry, ended up swinging really hard for Trump during the last election. And so this is a photo from the inauguration. And if you look at who's in this front row, you have Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. So Zuckerberg is Facebook, Bezos, Amazon. The guy with the goatee and the purple tie, Sundar Pichai. He's been CEO of Alphabet, the parent company for Google, since 2015. And then you have Elon Musk. Of course, between Bezos and Pichai, the bald guy, you see his side profile, that's Howard Lutnick, the guy who lied about being in the Epstein files. And a weird coincidence is that you saw all this buy-in from especially tech companies within the Trump administration, and now you see this huge push for data centers being built. One of the more controversial ones, and it's more tied with foreign policy, is the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. Some would say that it's a foreign lobby that doesn't have to register. Others would say that it's no, it's for the U.S., but mainly focused on U.S.'s cooperation with Israel. The same way I'm sure there's a very similar groups. The thing is that the AIPAC, for short, gives a lot of money to candidates on both sides. And as you can see in the graph on the right, there's this correlation between how much money you get and then how much money a politician is given and how much they give to Israel. Not saying it's causal, but it's correlated. So moving from internal limitations, we have external limitations on the president. And these normally come from the consent of at least the president or other presidents so they can get some sort of incentive too. So think of it as like a cost and a benefit. So one of the biggest ones is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The cost we pay is we have to spend X amount of our GDP or budget on military spending. And we have Article 5, which we'll get into. But so there's this big cost for NATO, and then the benefit we get is that we get assurances that, especially Germany breaks all the time, that they're going to do the same thing. And this is all centered around limiting Russian power. Of course, we have all the members of NATO here. And like I said, we have to spend X amount of money on defense spending, which it's the United States, so we don't really ever have issues hitting that goal. That's mainly cudgel against, like I said, especially Germany, who just don't love spending money on weapons. The other big cost is Article 5, which is this idea that an attack on one is an attack on all. We talked about this with September 11th. That's the only time Article 5 has ever been officially declared or initiated. So the attack on the United States, the 9/11 attacks, were seen by NATO members as an attack on Poland, as an attack on Turkey, as an attack on France, etc. But Paul, you super charismatic guy, what does that have to do with me personally? Well, or at least recently. 9/11 was a long time ago. Well, how would you feel if I told you Article 5 was almost declared just a few years ago? So we have the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. Part of this is that rockets are flying from Russia to Ukraine, and rockets are flying from Ukraine to Russia. Where this went south and almost ended very, very poorly for everybody involved was a rocket flew into Poland and killed two farmers. Poland is a NATO member, so Article 5 could have been instigated. It could have been declared. Um, Now, who sent the rocket was a matter of debate. At first, it was said to have been Russia, and the rocket went off course, or maybe didn't, and they're pretending it went off course. After investigation, what actually happened is it was a Ukrainian rocket that went off course and killed two Polish farmers, meaning that if it was seen as an act of war, which it wasn't, because we're not at war with Ukraine, but it would have actually instigated Article 5 against Ukraine, and the US would have had to declare war against Ukraine. That's following the strict letter of the law, only if you want to interpret it that way. So, of course, we didn't want to, no one wanted to. It was obviously an accident. But there was, at one point, legal justification for the United States to go to war with Ukraine, but just not a practical justification. And then similar to treaties, even though they kind of uphold their own field of understanding as international law. So it's the same thing as treaties a lot of the time. It's a state giving up the ability to do something because they don't want to live in a society where states can do that. We talked about chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. U.S. doesn't use mustard gas, one, because we don't want to, two, because we don't want anyone else to. So it's a very small cost to give for a big benefit. Where this comes into more hot water, we will say, is stuff like torture, where we don't want other people to torture, but the United States occasionally does want to torture people itself. So it creates this whole incentive to cheat or to pretend like they're following the rules when they actually don't. And like I said, Germany cheats on its NATO commitments constantly. So everyone's willing to put up with a little bit of cheating, especially back in like 2000. I'm not going to say it. 2010, 2011. This was a very big deal because we being the United States were hunting Osama bin Laden. And so if you ever see the movie Zero Dark 30, which we've talked about before, there's a ton of torture scenes within it. Now, how does the United States get around it? Well, the legal justification is like, it's not torture because we don't call it torture. We're going to call it, oh boy, what are we going to call it? Enhanced interrogation. And so it was all its intents and purposes, it was torture, but it was just called something different so the United States could legally justify it. And of course, it was just a rhetorical play. No one believed that enhanced interrogation is anything different than torture. There was one big method that everybody was talking about, debating whether or not it was torture, and that was it was called waterboarding. Or what you do is I'm not going to show pictures, but you lay someone on their back, put a rag over their face, and then pour water onto them. And what it does is it activates the gag reflex, and it supposedly simulates drowning. So there's this big argument on, does this count as torture or not? Because it's painful, but it's not ripping people's fingernails out with pliers or hooking car batteries up to their chests. or busting their legs open with wrenches or anything like that. You're mainly intact after waterboarding, just psychological trauma. So this writer, Christopher Hitchens, um, actually, and if I don't know if he's as big a name as he used to be, but Christopher Hitchens, big name, reliable guy, skeptic, um, underwent waterboarding to write his thoughts about it, and his article is titled "Believe Me, It's Torture." So before Bin Laden was killed in the Zero Dark 30 raid, there was especially a lot of talk about this. So the Zero Dark 30 raid was 2011. There was a lot of controversy over torture. Um, People would talk about this ticking bomb scenario, which is if you know that there's a ticking bomb but don't know where it is, the only way to find out where it is in time to save anybody, if you get, the only way to do that is to torture someone. Do you torture? So it became this big ethical point of argument. What ended up happening is, of course, Bin Laden was killed in 2011. It sort of came out that a key factor for this was that so many people had been tortured to find his location. But at the time, 9/11 was only 10 years old, so people are still very, very, very angry about it. And the idea that torturing led to that gave people sort of the justification to turn a blind eye to it. And so that's kind of what took it off the big national debate, is that it did result in Bin Laden's death. And so those are mostly security limitations or like conflict war limitations to the presidency. Being declaring war with the limitations on Congress, or not torturing people, not using chemical weapons, not using landmines, so what we classify under war crimes. But there's also economic limitations. Not only is there economic treaties like the WTO or World Trade Organization, there's also just sort of this integration of the global economy, or the idea that the United States isn't going to mess with this currency too much because it's such a big reserve currency for the whole world. And that, of course, reduces the supply of dollars, increasing the demand, which helps out the US economy a ton. And then there's this also the sort of intersection between economy and conflict, which is the fact that if you're trading with someone, if you have a big economic relationship with someone, you're less likely to go to war with them. And it's even if you want to. I don't think anyone's under any serious delusion that the United States and China like each other very much. But the simple fact is that the United States relies on China for all its cheap plastic, essentially crap that keeps the economy flowing, while China relies on the United States because it needs the market. They need people to sell to. And so you go to this sort of weird Texas standoff where China does not like the United States that much. The United States does not like China that much, but they both kind of need each other in this, frankly, sort of toxic way. But a lot of people would prefer a Mexican standoff to actually shooting at each other. And then there's the whole, we talked about domestic public opinion, but international public opinion. So during the Bush years, I talked about how it was pretty common for especially college students to have Canadian flags on their backpacks, hats, T-shirts, because Bush was so unpopular internationally that people didn't want to be associated with America a lot of the time. Meaning, a lot of people in other countries didn't want to deal with Americans, and a lot of Americans didn't want to have to justify all the baggage that came with the Bush administration. And this still goes on today, and it's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It mainly depends on where you travel. I think this got to be so popular because during the Canadian flag and Bush years got to be so popular because there was so much vitriol between the Bush administration and France, which is where a lot of college students will go during the summer. I went there for 2 months. It was awesome. This is during the Obama years, of course, but still. Um, Long-winded way of saying the president doesn't want the international community to hate America too much or hate Americans too much. No, it's asynchronous, so I can already, I think, we can't obviously talk about this in back and forth, but I imagine a lot of you are thinking, like, hold on, Paul, you're talking about all these limitations for the presidency, especially internationally, but you're also talking about basically only in terms of exceptions made to these rules. You're talking about the torture that did happen. You're talking about the time uh, presidents bucked international law and just did whatever they wanted. And that's true because we don't ever really see the times the president was limited as much. We can see it with like congressional votes on approving senior cabinet level positions and stuff like that. But we're not going to see any like big document where the president says, "I really wanted to invade Iran, but I knew that Congress would limit me." Um, so it's sort of playing off the exceptions to the rule while the rule still exists. Of course, the international community doesn't vote on the president, so when the president decides to break the rules internationally, the costs are much lower than the domestic costs. So this is a what it looks like when the president breaks an international law.
You win? You have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army. I guess that means you need to shut the fuck up. That's what I...
Yeah, Dave Chappelle. So why have rules and limitations to the presidency anyway? If the president really wants to, he can just break them. Well, first thing is he can't just break every rule. A lot of them he can, but impeachment is still a thing. Removal from office is still a thing. Richard Nixon had to resign because he was going to be impeached, and now, or he's going to be removed from office and impeached. We've never had a president actually removed from office, but it's sort of like the congressional vote on cabinet positions, where if you know you're not going to win, you don't play. So if a president knows he's going to be removed from office, like Nixon was probably going to be, he just resigns. The closest we've ever had to a president being removed from office was Tennessee's very own Andrew Johnson, which is a whole story in itself. But the president still does have to operate within limitations, which brings me to this metaphor of speed limits. Now, if you've taken my 102 or 265 class, you know where I'm going with this. We have speed limits whenever we drive, but basically everybody, except me, I would never break the law, but everybody tends to go around 5 miles over the speed limit, sometimes 10. So what the limitations of the presidency do is set up what's called norms. So we're all breaking the law. I mean, you're all breaking the law. I would never break the law, but you're all breaking the law when you go over 5 miles over the speed limit. Cops don't care. Most people don't care. So the same way we operate within the sort of gray area of the law, presidents have a little bit of leeway, and then we can look at the exceptions that way and look at the actual limitations of the presidency. And like what we've talked about, the presidential power grows and grows and grows after every administration. Probably the best metaphor I heard for it, one that stuck with me since I was an undergrad, was it's like a car jack. A car jack will go up and then down a little bit, and then up, and then down a little bit, and then up. But it's overall trending upwards. And so you can look at a president's power the same way, especially around emergencies. So World War II, Great Depression, financial crisis, September 11th, COVID. President gets a little bit of power, gives a little back, but mainly keeps holding on to power until the president has more and more unilateral authority to do stuff. And because this is on, it's almost instructive of limitations to the presidency. This is about half the length of this class. This module is about half the length of what the president can do. So we're going to leave it there. No need to belabor the point. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm going to change the due date on the activity this week to give you guys more time for it. I didn't put it up in time. That all being said, I hope you all have a great weekend. Enjoy the warming weather and stuff like that. And appreciate whoever came to the Thomas Paine event for coming. I'll leave it there. See ya.